So we are getting to the climax of our Meetings with Remarkable Men part of the Physics of Consciousness GRAIL quest here. And just to say, back at that community in North Carolina, one thing I failed to mention that leads up to the next part is when I realized we were on Cherokee sacred burial ground, literally the Trail of Tears, and that we were able to hear, I was able to hear on multiple occasions the actual cries, the voices of the ancient Cherokee. And that's when I began to deal with my clairaudience, which was, I see now, and I saw to some extent then, a direct result of my kundalini experience. So for me, of course, as Valerie will tell you, I'm very audio-oriented, ringing in the ears, etc. So clairaudience has been more of the cities associated with my kundalini than clairvoyance, which was my mother's case. So the experience on the Cherokee sacred burial ground and the memory of ancestors that I began to experience and hear, literally, people say hearing voices, but it's not just voices. It starts with the physics of kundalini, which is the ringing in the ear, called sangreal, song in the blood, which is actually, as Valerie even recognized, the voice of ancestors. You can tell by the ringing, as it were. And we now know that the kundalini biophysics is actually taking that sound current, the phonon component of the sacrocranial, as we discussed in our kundalini film with Arie, that actually drives the circulation of the magnetic current around the homunculus of the brain and drives that famous ringing of the resonance, natural resonance frequencies of the ventricle liquid horns of the brain. Literally why Moses and Lucifer have horns, measuring the completion of the kundalini circuit, meaning that's propagating magnetically, that your magnetic horns literally are propagating. So that connection between my experience of clairaudience related to kundalini, I learned much of directly from my mentor at that time, Ben Bentoff, Itzhak Bentoff, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, who we talked with about a lot in our kundalini film. But to fit that into this story, which is a good place to start with our remarkable men part of this story. So when I was living with the Gurdjieff community, the one in Marshfield, Massachusetts, called Greenfall, I think it was, and it was a Gurdjieff community that was kind of a satellite of the Gurdjieff Center, Claymont.org in West Virginia. And while I was there, I began to have the remarkable men part of the story. In fact, I started attending Michio Kushi's conferences in Boston and knew their 7th In and did physics of consciousness training with Michio Kushi at that time. And then I was invited by a scientist, a PhD from MIT named John Richardson, who at that time was running what I call the MIT Space Lab. Actually, it was the laboratory from which the Cygnus X-1, world's first X-ray astronomy satellite, was being steered. And John Richardson invited me regularly to come to MIT to that laboratory. And you know what I did there? I used the computer plotter in that laboratory for the first time to prove that 10 spirals of the golden mean made infinite nest of pentacles, literally implosive pentagram. So the first two-dimensional accurate mathematical model of pure implosion, which only later I learned was hydrogen structure, we did at the plotter at the MIT Space Lab with John Richardson. And I also met Amy Clymer, my psychic astrologer at the time. And I also met, who's that famous at MIT? Well, anyway, I had adventures at MIT, let me say. But that's when, for some reason, Ben Bentoff invited me to his home. And I started working with him because I had back...
This was when you were in the Gurdjieff school.
Well, remember, the Gurdjieff school is Claymont.org, but after that, subsequently, I moved into a Gurdjieff community in Marshfield, Massachusetts, which is obviously, you know, quite a distance from there, called Windfall. And at that Gurdjieff community, this physicist, John Richardson, came to do sacred gymnastics with us at the Gurdjieff School. And we, of course, started to talk physics.
Yeah.
And I ended up at the MIT Space Lab.
Okay.
And subsequently was invited to Bentoff's laboratory. Now remember Bentoff, how he measured kundalini, what's called capacitive accelerometer. It's literally, it's very much related to the polygraph that I was experienced from graduate school, except the plates of the capacitor are above and below your chair, and you are the dielectric modulating the plates of capacitor, and any micromotion is picked up so sensitively that he can measure the pulse of your heartbeat pushing down on your chair. And so from that, the subcomponents of the phone of that pulse, he was able to document the phase entrainment of the ringing in the ears, actually. And so I worked with him. And I mean, at that time, what he did, today we would use a digital recording, polygraphy, etc. At that time, he had an analog polygraph and a Polaroid camera to record the strip chart recordings. He was a genius. He had invented that device that you could steer the worm in a heart operation down the vein into the heart. So you've got your thumb over here, and the catheter's front nose was being directed by your thumb like several feet away down that cord. And he invented a lot of the biophysical inventions. So he was a biophysics engineer. He was an absolute genius. And at that time, then he wrote his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum. And then he was with us when Gus Ciccacci, the other friend who introduced me to Bucky Fuller, when Gus and Bucky Fuller and I were at this palace in Florence, Italy, Bentoff actually joined us on his way to the Maharishi's lab in Switzerland, where they were measuring the physics of consciousness, actually. And Bentoff called me his guardian angel on one occasion there. And also who joined us was, who's the Sufi leader?
Pierre Vilayet.
Yeah, Pierre Vilayet was with us at that conference. And I was there with my TI-59 calculator doing sacred geometry calculations and, imagining the physics of all these things and looking at the beautiful power of sacred geometry to teach us the physics of bliss experience. And interestingly, Pierre Vilayet Khan's lecture at that conference was about physics of consciousness, actually. And his enthusiasm was great, and he had the emotional connection beautifully. But the actual physics, it was later then, and let's kind of go down our list. So then, it was later then when I was living in Amsterdam, when I met Valerie at the Making Love Visible laboratory, and we had just invented the heart tuner when, because I was doing the next version of my heart coherence invention from Buffalo, New York, Millard Fillmore Hospital, when I first measured heart coherence. And then I had been invited multiple times to Heart Math Institute, where I showed them how to take their first EKG, how to take a power spectrum of EKG, and how to measure heart coherence. And then I developed the mathematics to quantify heart coherence in one elegant variable called the second order power spectrum, the cepstrum, which is later when I was credited in the literature with inventing the concept of heart coherence. So later in Amsterdam, we're developing the next third or fourth, right now, the fifth version of my heart coherence technology is called realheartcoherence.com, and you can measure empathy, you can measure tantra, and it's literally a lie detector because your heart becomes a laser when you speak your truth.
So is this kind of similar with the measurements of the emotions?
Well, there's a relationship in that when you're measuring emotion from the shape of touch, which is what Manfred Klein's pioneered, that the shape of pressure over time idealizes that golden ratio. So you literally make implosion when you hug someone and you say, I love you. It's measurable. That implosion is measurable. Now, in the EKG, people talk about golden ratio in the heart, but actually the heart structure, 7 layers of heart muscle, as Pettigrew confirmed in the dissections, which became Fields of Form, Vortex of Life by Lawrence Edwards. The layers of heart muscle are exactly the 7 spin symmetry axes of a tetrahedra, the physics of the origin Hebrew as well. You couldn't get a better squeeze. And that is cubic. And if you take a power spectrum of an EKG, you get a harmonic series based on powers of 2. You do not get golden ratio. What you do find, however, is that the musical fundamental of the EKG, which is the low frequency coherence, will go from 1 second, 60 seconds, 60 cycles, 60 beats per second, to 0.618 seconds, so that the heart rate actually increases when you go from stuck in your head to touchy-feely, feeling your heart. So actually, if you calibrate the heart music by heart rate, you can actually determine that the heart rate increases when you choose permission to touch. And that is related to golden ratio, at least 0.618 seconds. But in the brain waves, that's where you get the golden ratio. And that's what we discovered at the time. So we had just finished the second or third, it was called Heart Link, and then it was called Heart Tuner, and now it's called RealHeartCoherence.com. But at that time, I invented a parallel product called Bliss Tuner. I was working with Marty Woodkey, who's also famous, who introduced me to Deepak Chopra at the time, and we had fun at his lab as well, who loved the Star Mother kit, by the way. But Marty Woodkey, having solved his own addiction heroin problem using biofeedback, taught me really some advanced brainwave science. And so when I realized that the preamplifier that we were using to invent the heart tuner at that time could also do brainwaves, because you need, your EKG is about 1 millivolt, 1 to 5 millivolt, or your EEG is about 1 to 5 microvolt, millionths of a volt. So you need an amplifier that's 1,000 times more sensitive. And so an amplifier that'll do both, obviously, is valuable, but also requires more skill in noise reduction. But so anyway, we had the right hardware to do brainwaves and heart biofeedback. And so that's when we built the first Bliss tuner. And just at that time is when I found out that who became my good friend later, Professor Konstantin Korotkov in Russia, he had just finished his studies, World Without Blindness in St. Petersburg, measuring kids, and they go into trance and then they can see without their eyes. And he published his first paper saying there were several indicators like fractality in the aura, but the primary indicator of which child trance was enabling them to see without their eyes, the primary indicator was that the ratio of their alpha to their beta was golden mean ratio. He just published that paper. So I'm there sitting in Amsterdam in that laboratory saying, we got it, this is the clue, this is the clue, this is going to prove everything. And so that's when we built the Bliss tuner, and we turned that idea into a way to teach bliss replicably, measurably. What at that time was called the Bliss tuner, the earlier version of my invention. Right now, it's called flameinmind.com. And this is where we're getting close to a climax for our story, because after all this grail of the real physics of consciousness, what is the real physics of consciousness? So now we're knowing that peak perception, peak experience, peak bliss, peak focus is replicably correlated to golden ratio between harmonics in the brainwaves. That is replicable. That's solid data. So we've been doing that for, 10, 15 years. But where do all the clues come together to really tell us what is the physics of consciousness? That's the thing.
Well, I guess there is something that came together with the scientist in Russia doing the invention of the seeing without eyes, and you realized, oh, this is the ratio of the heart and the brain waves. And like he was the missing link, kind of.
Well, that's certainly one of the most beautiful early missing links, absolutely. There's another step to actually understanding the real physics of consciousness, because knowing that brainwaves make golden ratio when you have peak perception is a good start. However, you need to realize what that's doing in order to know what the physics of consciousness is. And what that comes down to is understanding how it is that golden ratio is giving you that perfect squeeze, enabling compression, enabling implosion. So actually, golden ratio in brainwaves is not the climax event. The climax event actually is what's happening to that plasma tornado inside your head. That's the actual physics of consciousness. And that's why, getting back to Gary Schwartz and Stuart Hameroff, who are saying perfected charge collapse in the microtubule is the physics of consciousness. It's a good introduction, but it's not the climax. The climax event requires understanding a few more things. For example, we had 2 International Physics of Consciousness symposia when I was young. One was in Toronto. I was there with Eva Reich, Wilhelm Reich's daughter, I believe, and one at Harvard. And at that one, I met Bill Tiller. Bentoff was there, all the greats. Lisa Nella there, Bentoff's partner, who wrote Kundalini, Psychosis, or Transcendence. I ended up traveling with Lisa Nella, and then Elizabeth Rauscher, who was my friend in the West Coast, who became one of the world's most famous physicists. And we had many adventures with Elizabeth Rauscher. That's sort of another whole story. But the meeting with Bill Tiller, who was one of the leading physicists at the Physics of Consciousness Symposium at the universities in Boston, later, his book, Conscious Acts of Creation, in which he measured about 10 different ways that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. That was a turning point, because now we have the smoking gun, many forms of measurement. Conscious human attention causes charge to get squeezed. Very important concept. So how do you account for that? And then, in later years, we learn that if you take that perfect squeeze in plasma in charge called Therify.net, which squeezes plasma, and out the center comes this longitudinal compressional array, think Kesjan body or rainbow light body or Ba from the Ka, and we measure and replicate and get duplicated reports that helps trigger lucid dreaming, meaning the ability to propagate your aura coherently, action at a distance, longitudinal interferometry. So now we have most of our clues in front of us, because not only do we need to explain why focused attention compresses charge, and at that time Uri Geller had just measured the fact that focused human attention reduces radioactivity. And he was adopted by my friend Andrea Puharich, who channeled the Nine, and is why Deep Space Nine was written, actually. And Elena Danaan is describing now advanced plasma beings named the Nine, which Andrea Puharich called Atun, later related to the Enki story, the whole ET story. So Andrea Puharich was with us at all the international psychotronics conferences, where I taught many times in Ohio and then in Colorado. We had Psychotronics International Conferences, and it just recently published the International Psychotronics lecture I did with Tom Vallone about 27 years ago. And Tom Vallone lived at my farm and traveled with us. He was the other physics of consciousness pioneer. So, the climax missing piece. What was the climax missing piece? The climax missing piece actually was Iris. You know, Iris working with the kids? You met Iris, did you? Yeah?
Yeah.
What was she doing? She was...
Yeah, helping the kids to see without their eyes.
Yes. In my view, that is the climax missing piece. Because, you know, I was invited to speak at this conference in Amsterdam now, Breakthrough Energy Movement, about 2 years ago. And I decided to go specifically because I wanted to meet Iris there, because she had this group of kids she was teaching to see without their eyes. And Patrick Botti, our genius programmer, flameinmind.com, he's nearby in Belgium, and he came with us, and we met all these kids. And that's when we're sitting there, and Iris is telling us, you know what all the kids say? If you ask them, well, you know, they go into this trance bliss state, and then we've measured, we identified, you get a golden ratio and an octave harmonic cascade in the brain waves, indicating implosive compression, a perfect squeeze. And Iris then says, yeah, and if you ask the kids, what do you see inside your head? They all say they're looking down a tube, a tornado. And they line it up and they see through this tube.
But, question, how how can you compress plasma to open the tube?
That's the right question. She always asks the right question. Not the easy question.
No.
Well, no. What Lara is saying is, how does a tornado get an eyeball? Is that about the question?
Yeah. How can you have how can you create this pressure that this eyeball is going to be open?
You see, again, a little more background here. So when I wrote a series of papers called The Phase Conjugate Origins of Perception. And it turns out there's other famous scientists now who have written a phase conjugate model of perception. You can read all about that at fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. Point being is, when waves conjugate, and to visualize that, it's our GRAIL animation. That's waves conjugate. It's a caduceus revolved, and waves conjugate, converge, implode, perfecting fractality using golden ratio. When they do that, at the convergence point, which we now know is always tuned to Planck, the musical key of the universe, at that compression threshold, there is a sorting into phase. A sorting, which is the key to perfect perception. That compression and sorting into phase is the result of perfected compression. What that means is, all the waves that want to go through that vortex, that get through the center, can only get through center if they emerge locked into phase. So all destructive interference is eliminated, only coherence results. And that process of sorting into phase, which is a result of phase conjugation, is actually named perception because the very physics of that sorting process is the beginning of consciousness itself, the ability to decide what can and what cannot pass the center of that vortex. So essentially, perception is that ability to sort into phase. Whether it's touch, smell, that it's actually, in every case, that perfecting compression in different bandwidths identifies perception, because that begins to identify the willful sorting, which is literally consciousness, which literally, consciousness means with turning inside out ness. Conscious, S-C-I-O-U-S, turning inside out ness. With turning inside out ness. And turning inside out ness perfected, you know, our donut that turns inside out, that's implosive compression. So inside your head,
it's like going inwards?
That's a good start. But if you're an electrical engineer, you need more than just some guru tells you go inside.
Yeah.
No, electrical engineers want to know exactly what's happening. So what's happening is that plasma vortex tornado is getting compressed and tuned to Planck so that it can implode. And then some of the inertia emerges superluminally in the longitudinal array, and the propagation of that longitudinal array is the electric field called consciousness, the aura of the saint, as it were. That's why when you have a bliss experience, plants grow better outside your window, because the field has been sorted, and therefore charge distribution has been perfected and growth is enabled. That's why it's rose petal shaped.
So, but it needs specific practice.
Well, we've always known that bliss is food for your environment. That's old. Every religion knows that if the saint lives there, everybody wants to come and drink the bath water. That's old news. We're explaining the physics of why. The physics of why is because when someone has bliss there, they have created order electrically in that environment. And that is measurable.
Yeah.
They have served. That's why there are rainbows when Tibetans die, because they literally implode that environment electrically, which is the physics of the reason color exists. It's well documented. Tibetan saints' death causes rainbows. You can statistically make that case. I'm the first one to explain the physics of why and how that works. So when the child is having this coherent brainwave cascade, which they call trance, relaxation, then they focus and then they see this tornado inside their head. They're learning to grab the vortex by the throat using the musical harmonic cascade of their brainwave and compress it to a point of focus called an eyeball, where the waves are sorted. And that becomes...
But is it like pushing...
Self-aware.
but is it like pushing you, because it's like seeing without your eyes?
Yes.
So it's something is asked from you that's not possible.
Well,
in a way, you
but
know.
you see,
So
the
it's
beautiful thing is that kids all over the world are doing this. I mean, this is very common nowadays. Kids seeing with their eyes. They used to see through their skin.
But is that what the compression makes? Like, okay, they ask me to see without my eyes, and it's possible. So I will just focus till there's so much focus that it's.
And the focus literally is enabled compression. That's what focus is. And that enabled compression takes all that inertia and squeezes it down to implode through the Planck threshold. And that implosion starts inertia cascading centripetally through center. The definition of consciousness. There now we just explained exactly why and how Bill Tiller measured 10 different ways focus attention causes electric fields to implode, compress. Now we know why. And we can begin to talk about all these medical surgeons who just came back from near-death experiences and said they traveled outside their body. You know, PhD surgeons all around the world are now documenting they took their vision outside their head. They even know what part of the room they were looking from at the surgeons cutting a hole in their head during their near-death experience. So now we know what went outside your head when you were looking at your body from outside your body. I mean, millions, if not billions of people have had the experience of seeing their body from outside their body. I mean, all these people can't be lying. So what does an electrical engineer have to say about that? I say I know exactly what they took with them. A plasma vortex, a tornado. And now we know, because Therify.net, longitudinal, helps create lucid dreaming, we know how that tornado is generated. Implode the plasma, make a plasma vortex, propagate this coherent longitudinal compressional wave into that array, and that's what you take with you. Lucid dreaming, remote viewing, astral travel, and near death. So that is a compelling, in my view, compelling physics of consciousness. A real measurable, Bill Tiller measured it, we measure it in the brain waves, we measure longitudinal coherence. It reduces radioactivity measurably. I mean, if ever there was a measurable physics of consciousness.
So would you say that your mission to find the Holy Grail is accomplished?
Well, you know, literally, I mean, in my view, literally, when I took that caduceus of golden spirals down a cone and revolved it and made the Grail animation, and we now know that that's exactly how and why hydrogen is imploding. And we know that's exactly how and why brainwaves implode. So that is literally the Grail of consciousness. Electrically, we have discovered the Holy Grail of consciousness, and it's the Holy Grail. But if you're saying, are we done yet? Well, actually, no. Because, you see, what we need to now prove, something that actually Tom Bearden already did prove. You know, when the transverse wave is squeezed down that perfect cone, it emerges as this longitudinal scalar compressional. Tom Bearden was the first guy to prove by equation that is a gravity wave. Well, if that's the physics of the reason how hydrogen makes gravity, which we prove by equation now, nobody could argue, 3 dominant radii of hydrogen are golden ratio times Planck. That is a smoking gun that hydrogen is fractal conjugate, and by implication, that implosive charge squeeze of infinite non-destructive compression, Einstein's name for gravity, is the reason hydrogen makes gravity. Well, if that's true, and we know that the saints, I think, was it Valerie's, one of your teachers, the lady would float? We know that these saints, they float all the time. They obviously can make some gravity. So, and by the way, humans are getting a little bored driving around in cars powered by dinosaurs farting, so they probably need to understand the cause of gravity. Because now we know the cause of consciousness, and the cause of gravity is the same. That means we probably no longer need dinosaurs to fart in order to drive a car. Right? It should be obsolete, actually. We should, and when we know how gravity is made, we can make propulsion. So in my next interview with Elena Danaan, we are going to be teaching, who's the galactic history, the representative of the Galactic Federation here. You check out Elena Danaan, and now Michael Sala, exopolitics.org, is teaching Elena Danaan and Alex. So all of us studying the ET history agree now. My next interview with her is about the physics of propulsion. Literally, the electrical difference between the warp propulsion and the impulse power in Star Trek. We have the equations. We know what it is. And by the way, that way we could be propelled. And I think that's happily ever after.
Well, me too.
We had a little fun.